Hello and welcome to bigbyte. We're a small boutique consultancy specializing on large-scale transformations, often supported by SAP software. Our focus lies on inventory optimization under careful consideration to also raise availability, fill rates, and service levels. Our customers, small and large, have experienced rapid improvements and are now expanding the tactics and methods we implement to their entire organization. The results are large-scale efficiency increases and standardization across the board. Allow me to elaborate on why I believe in the bigbyte philosophy and why it has been so successful. There are primarily three things we believe will make a big positive difference in your planning and execution. First, the transformation to a rule-based planning system. I don't know whether your planners plan by chance and only react to problems instead of planning ahead, but that is what we see happening in lots of organizations. Planners pick parts they consider important and then analyze these parts' performance, and when they are not happy with the result, they make decisions that often are not thought through entirely, not considering unintentional consequences, but are rather based on momentous ideas to apply a quick fix that eventually fails. It's all happening in a lawless system where every planner devises their own scheme of planning and monitoring, often executed with spreadsheets, lacking any integrational balance or effective communication with suppliers and partners, internally or externally. This is the first thing we suggest to transform into a rule-based system where every planner thinks alike and acts alike, where planners devise the rules and the system executes the rules and alerts the planner when there is a true exception to the rule. Second, we promote the application of absorption-based planning. What we mean by that is simple. Absorb the noise and variability that undoubtedly develops in your planning as much as you possibly can. This should be your primary mantra. Noise absorption at all cost. It is a fact that noise and variability degrades your supply chain performance. In fact, noise and variability are your biggest foe in your efforts to deliver supply chain excellence, providing great service with minimum investment in inventory holdings. So it should be your number one goal to minimize variability and noise. How can you do that? Well, you either stop the noise from coming in or you absorb it when it is present. Now, variability exists and develops both from the demand side as well as from the supply side. But there is not much you can do when your customers change their mind or your suppliers deliver randomly. And supply chains without variability and noise do not exist. Therefore, absorption is an excellent means to greater performance and stability. But most organizations implement and use planning systems that do not absorb noise, but rather promote it to higher levels even. Chasing forecast accuracy and trying to be as accurate as possible with the amount of inventory one orders from the supplier is one such fatality. The bullwhip effect is given free rein and the rest is history. And third, we want you to embrace the exception-minded business and go away from looking at everything every day and not seeing the forest for the trees. Instead of a chance-based monitoring of what the planner can cope with at any given planning day, we suggest the carrying out of exception-based monitoring of your materials and product portfolios. After the implementation of a rule-based system, your SAP will know what an exception to the rule is and what it is not. Instead of thousands of meaningless exception messages that the planner tries to sort and work through every day, they can follow a standard workflow to cure and monitor exceptions in a prioritized way. That is a much more efficient way to manage your supply chain than simply applying fixes that cause unintended consequences, which cause more exceptions for the next day. Now, what constitutes a rule-based planning system? It is pretty much the opposite of a chance-based planning system. When you plan by chance, you pick your problem items and then take measures to immediately fix what is perceived to be the problem. This is what most people refer to as firefighting or expediting. Unfortunately, in a system like this, no one knows how many fires are burning and where they are burning. But it's not only the parts or items you pick that's out of control, it's all the measures that are taken. What do we do if we think we have too much inventory? Is it really too much inventory? What do we do if we have too little inventory? And how much is too little? Is the supplier the problem? Might it be that the supplier wasn't told early enough what to deliver? Or did we not see what we need today when we were planning 3 weeks ago, because back then we had too much? No one knows, and if no one knows, then how can we expect that the measures we take today will deliver the results for tomorrow? Without any procedures or guidelines, that is very difficult to do. Not so when you lay down the rules. At bigbyte, we construct decision trees after the segmentation of material and product portfolios. The portfolios are classified according to various dimensions like slow mover, high mover, according to consumption consistency, lead times, price, volume, and of course your ABC analysis according to volume contribution. Once the segmentation is done, we follow the various paths. For example, take all regular parts that are high movers and exhibit consistent consumption. At the end of that path, you will then identify the rule, or as we say, the policy that should be used for all those parts, which exhibit the same or similar patterns. In this example, we decide that we always use a dynamic buffer for all regular parts that are moving a lot and that are consumed consistently from period to period. Now the guesswork is gone. Each planner knows what rule to use in what situation and for what part. To be crystal clear and to instill confidence in successful planning, we document the policy with all its detail. Here we can see that the dynamic buffer uses a material forecast with MRP type VV in combination with a dynamic safety buffer using a range of cover profile. It is even clear what buffers the planner should assign to each part and how the policy works when running MRP. The planner can also learn about the benefits the policy provides and use a checklist that guides her or him to set the policy in the system. We realize that setting up the decision tree and all necessary policies is quite a considerable effort. But think about the time you save on a day-to-day basis if all you need to watch for is when a policy doesn't deliver the expected results and the system alerts you of it with a new, now meaningful exception message. Let's now talk about absorption-based planning. Please forgive me here for introducing yet another 3-letter acronym and another buzz phrase. We are not intending to invent another theory, but simply state the obvious. If you don't absorb noise and variability, you will end up with noise and variability in your supply chain. And no one can argue that noise and variability are helpful for the supply chain performance. No, they degrade it. So obviously we should absorb as much of it as we can. And that is why we want to do absorption-based planning. Now, how does it work? Let's first talk about what doesn't work. Chasing and or adjusting forecasts. You have all seen and worked with charts like the one we see here. The sales planner devises a forecast and tries to be as accurate as possible. We often see a sales forecast of 460 pieces for July, 433 pieces in August, and 488 pieces in September. The whole system then gets set up to chase those numbers as accurately as possible. Accurately in terms of meeting the exact quantity at the exact date. But by the time the most perfect, closest forecast has been set, most numbers have changed. It is then that the supply will be adjusted, will be rescheduled, will be rearranged. This results in constant rescheduling and resulting firefighting on the supply side. Why is that? Because there are no buffers to absorb the variability, and not only is the variability transferred all the way all the way back to the supplier? No, it is even amplified by the well-known bullwhip effect. Most planners will now argue that they fixed the situation with a safety stock. Nothing could be further from the truth. The safety stock does absolutely nothing except that the additional inventory ends up in dead stock. Unused inventory that costs you a lot of money. A very different way to do this would be to execute on absorption-based planning. With it, you avoid the constant firefighting on the supply side because you absorb most of the noise before it enters the system. The key to it is that you add a cushion or a buffer on the demand side. This buffer will absorb the difference in terms of quantities or dates that come through variability on the demand side. But it does not absorb all the changes. It absorbs variability to the degree of the size of the buffer. Once the buffer is exceeded, the remaining variability will move through and into the system. Think of it like a shock absorber in your car. When you ride through a pothole, you don't want to feel the shock. That is why cars have shock absorbers. They absorb the shock at the source before it's transmitted further. What we are doing in deterministic traditional planning is the opposite. We're letting the shock waves all the way through, from the customer all the way to the supplier. Therefore, absorption-based planning must deliver better results because it keeps the noise out. And keeping the noise out means that we level the demand for supply. Why is that important? Because if we give our suppliers, externally or internally, from a manufacturing plant, even demand, they will perform much more reliable with much more shorter lead times. And if we experience a reliable inflow of material supply, our entire supply chain will function a lot more efficient. We'll experience much higher availability of parts and products with much lower need for inventory holdings. Higher service levels with lower inventory. To sum it up, don't put demand plans out there anymore with uneven numbers. They are very hard to meet when you depend on suppliers who have to deliver to constantly varying demand. Instead, look at your demand plan like this. Absorb the unevenness in additional inventory, a buffer you place in order to absorb variability. With this, we can derive the most important rule about absorption-based planning. Instead of trying to plan to bring in exactly what you need, at exactly the time you think you need it, with exactly the quantity you think you need it, anticipate the variability that will hit the supply chain and absorb as much as possible in a dynamic buffer. Now, the move into the exception-minded business is mainly driven by a change of mindset. Planners who have executed on the chance-based planning and monitoring process for years have a very hard time letting go of all they have developed over the years. After all, they have managed to make it work. I'm not saying it's all bad out there, but the question remains, how much effort must they invest to get satisfactory results? Could there be a better result? And shouldn't the system, the one we spend so much money to implement, do the brunt of the heavy lifting for us? As we at bigbyte suggest that you're transforming to the exception-minded business, we want to warn you that the exception-minded business can only work if you cover your bases beforehand. A sound basis with no outdated supply elements, no inconsistent or false basic data, and only with the right mindset about absorption and other supply chain dynamics is an absolute and necessary requirement before you take the journey. You must put standard operating procedures in place and define the rules as we discussed it here before. For the standard operating procedures, we can help with some templates. But in the end, your planners must set up the system for success. A typical day in the life of a materials planner can serve as a guide for them for effective management and monitoring of exception messages. And then there is decision-making support like the OODA loop, a guide for decision-making invented by Colonel John Boyd. It can make a great positive difference with your expediting and necessary adjustments that are still to be made, even with or especially because the exception-minded business. With the OODA loop, instead of dealing separately with every exception, we're taking a more holistic approach to problem solving and decision making. We observe the outcomes and relate them to our framework of reference, so as to arrive at a decision that we eventually also act upon. The OODA loop provides us with the guidance, information, and authority to apply fixes that are sustainable and without unintended consequences. The OODA loop is more than just a circle you go around. The extended use of the OODA is that it gives you guidance in your decision-making, implicit guidance that is. What that means is that after you observe, letting the world around you tell you what's going on, you use your experience, mental models, and your intuition to build context about the situation, and then decide and act to correct and improve the situation. In other words, if you observe an exception, use the framework of reference with the rules and policies you have defined in your model and act accordingly. So eventually, you should of course see the positive results. In one example, we have seen inventory reductions of almost 50% over 6 months, while at the same time, the fill rate of the product portfolio was rising from 85% to 95% by 10 points. Those are tremendous outcomes in a very rapid time frame. With all that was said here, I am mostly excited about the methodology's simplicity and pragmatism. You don't have to move mountains in order to achieve what we suggest here. Simply lay down your rules, use common sense in your planning, and manage exceptions instead of chaos. However, the most critical success factor probably is that you must form new habits in your planning organization. And habits come from repetition. Just be careful not to repeat the wrong things. Define the rules first and be careful to define the correct rules. Then standardize. What are you waiting for? Now is the time.